Hi everyone, and welcome to today's ELT CPD podcast episode with two very special guests who you may have heard on the show before, John Hughes and Kath Bilsborough. Thanks both so much for coming on. It's wonderful to speak to you again, and I'm really excited to hear about your new course that you've launched. Thank you. So let's get started maybe with you, Kath. So as I said, you've both been on the podcast before, so people already know lots about you and your backgrounds. You're definitely both famous within ELT materials writing. So perhaps you could give us sort of your top three most enjoyable or memorable ELT projects that you've worked on so far in your career.
Okay, thanks, Billy. That's a good question. It's very hard to choose even just three, but a couple that spring to mind. One was materials that I wrote for the Plan Sebal project. I don't know if you're familiar with that, run by the British Council and the Minister of Education in Uruguay. And basically, we had to create materials for remote teaching and remote learning. So they were very, very specific, because what you had students in a classroom teacher with a very low level of English in the classroom, and a remote teacher who was zooming in for the English lessons, who was not in the classroom, but was maybe in another city or even another country. And it was quite challenging because we had to make the materials work in such a way that the classroom teachers didn't feel kind of null and void, if you like. So we had to create activities that gave the classroom teacher a role. Yeah. So it was, and it was very rewarding. It was a bit of a challenge. And then when I actually saw it in action, that was quite nice, because it kind of worked eventually. That's just one. And another one I've enjoyed doing recently has been writing very low level resources for low resource context. So
oh, nice.
Yeah, so countries where they don't have the internet, or areas of countries where regions where they haven't got internet access. So I was writing some radio materials that were going to be delivered by radio stations, and the level there was very low, so there's lots of challenges there, but it felt kind of rewarding, if you like, because, and a good reminder that not everything is the really sort of techie and new.
Yeah, definitely.
And the third one I'll just mention very quickly is not a favorite. It's the worst thing I've ever done, but I think I'll mention it because it's more fun. Be careful what you say yes to, I think, is the message here. So I agreed to write materials for an online game years ago. And basically what I had to do was write 500 multiple choice questions, and the game was like the students would go around this kind of on a trips and then get to places and answer a question. And I thought, wow, that's brilliant, that's easy, that's so easy to do, and everything seemed fine, but it was just so monotonous and so dull. And after about, I kept counting how many I'd done, and have I got to 500 yet? And it would be like, you're on 97, you're on 98. And so yeah, they're my three.
I really like the first two that you mentioned, because they're sort of thinking differently. They're not sort of your typical course book or your typical sort of digital project that you're working on. It's really, really nice. John, same to you. If you want to include your worst project as well, do feel free.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really difficult one to answer, because there are different sort of landmarks in terms of writing. There's the time you write your very first book, and that's all very exciting. And the first book I ever wrote was called Lessons in Your Rucksack, and that was my own idea. And I went to a small publisher and said, can I write this book to help teachers who are literally setting off with a backpack and going off to teach? And it was just packed with sort of ideas. And That was just, I remember that just being exciting to write because it was the first time I saw myself printed books. I was thinking how much I enjoyed writing on projects that were connected with teacher training, teacher development. So I'm one of those weird authors that actually likes writing teachers' books to go with course books. I find it relaxing and enjoyable. And one of the projects I liked on a series I did, Business Result, I did a lot of the teachers' books there, but also created a teacher training course with video. And we got a video company in, and I designed sort of short films of teachers teaching with the materials, and then we interviewed people about teaching business English, and it was designed to help general English teachers move into business English. And I've always liked working with video, so that was a fun project to do. And yeah, I mean, teacher training, teaching support. So the project me and Kath are doing now, creating materials to train teachers how to write. That's kind of the project that's in my head at the moment, and I've been enjoying working on that because that's the sort of, you know, it's always the next project's kind of the one you get fired up about, hopefully.
Definitely, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the course that you just mentioned that you and Kath have launched. You gave us a quick summary of it, but what does the course entail? Obviously, as much detail as you can give or can't give. John, why don't you tell us about it?
So it's online. There are 10 live sessions. We use Zoom. The course is kind of split into two halves. So the first half is sort of technical skills like writing good instructions or writing to level, analyzing text, sourcing text, the basic sort of principles of materials writing that nobody ever seems to train teachers. It's quite amazing on teacher training courses. Writing materials is just never really covered. I've always found teachers just have to kind of do it and learn through trial and error. When in fact there's some real basic principles that you can cover quite quickly. So that's what we do in the first part of the course. Then there's a little break. Participants do some writing for us and we give them some individualized feedback. So there's kind of one-to-one feedback, which probably is going to be one of the most useful parts of the course. Part two, we then go a bit more into sort of creative areas of materials writing. We think about creativity, how you might use images, using video. And then towards the end of the course, we're thinking about professional development. Some people come on the course, they just want to improve their materials for their own lessons. Some people come on the course because they want to develop themselves as materials writers and possibly move into paid publishing work. So there are different requirements, but we'll obviously help people with that. And then they write another set of material, but the second set is more, can be anything they want. It could be creating video content, it could be something online, it could be whatever's going to be useful for them. That's basically the course.
Yeah, you're totally right. And like there's not the basic principles that people learn behind materials writing, especially when you just sort of come from teaching. Writing paid materials is completely different, like you said. So it's really valuable. What's the name of the course? Sorry.
At the moment, it's just writing ELT materials.
Nice.
And we use our shorthand has become the word WEM, W-E-M. So
I've seen your hashtag on LinkedIn. Is it Wednesday? I think.
Well, on Wednesdays on social media, we release something and we call it Wednesday. The hashtag.
I like that. Who came up with that?
I'd like to think I did, actually.
John.
So when you like the people that are applying for your course, are you sort of mainly seeing teachers that are coming into it, or are you sort of seeing experienced materials writers? Kath, what are you seeing?
A range, a wider range than we ever expected. I think we expected to see mainly teachers, maybe a couple of people who had written some materials for publication or whatever and might want to learn more. But we've got people who work for publishers. We've got people who are teacher trainers. We've got, people in different areas like business English, CLIL, primary, secondary, adults, a range really. If we think that anyone who applies might not be the right fit, then we kind of have a chat to them and make sure that they understand what we're doing. And sometimes they might say, okay, that's not for us. Or sometimes they might say, yeah, I understand that. For example, we've got somebody on the course who isn't teaching English, they're teaching another language, but they are fully aware that they have to do the assignments, everything's in English, and then later they're going to obviously, you know, put that to use for their own context. So it's been quite surprising, and it's quite great, but it's good because that means that in the community there are people able to help each other. There's an editor who is thinking of moving into writing, you know, so there's people who bring different perspectives, and we are learning from them.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to say everyone's learning from each other, you know, and then you can sort of take that going forward with other courses as well. John, you mentioned you give feedback during the course as well. So what sort of things are you looking for? What sort of things do you look for specifically when you give that feedback?
Well, on the assignment specifically, we've been looking to give the feedback focuses on things that we've covered. So if we've looked closely at ways of writing instructions, or what you might call rubrics or direction lines, then obviously the focus is a little bit on that. We also, as part of it, we've been looking at what you put into teachers' notes to accompany the materials to. So if you're creating a worksheet, what kind of notes do the teachers need? So in the teachers' notes, we might give feedback on, well, a teacher's going to need to know this, this, and this is missing, that kind of thing. And then we're looking for kind of the flow in the material. So one of the tasks is to write a complete worksheet that will work in a sort of a complete lesson. So there you're looking at the ability to organize a series of exercises that have a good flow. And then we're looking at has the person sort of thought about different ways of analyzing that flow and considered how the materials might be used. I mean, one of the areas is a bit tricky, because with materials writing, you can write materials for yourself and your own context, which some of the people on the course are doing. And then there's other teachers who are, or materials writers who are looking to write materials that other teachers will use. And when it comes to thinking about materials for other teachers, there are other things to consider. So we would give feedback on that as well. Like, you know, if a teacher took it into a completely different classroom context, would they understand from the material what they were supposed to do? They're not necessarily the same thing, writing for yourself and writing for others.
Definitely. And it's so varied, isn't it? There's so many different things when you think about ELT materials, like you said, for yourself to use, for the students to use, to recycle the language, maybe something digital, maybe some sort of resources. It's all encompassing, isn't it, really? Videos as well. Do you think there's something specific or some sort of experience that makes someone a good materials writer? Is there something that you can think of, Kath? Or do you think anybody could potentially learn to be a good materials writer?
Maybe not anybody. In the same way as not anybody could be a teacher, I think. So there are skills, I think. And I think that, I mean, hopefully that's what John and I are doing, helping people develop those skills. But I do think that certain teachers already have some of those skills, especially the ones who think a little bit about the materials that they're using, think about the type of content that might be engaging, etc. So I don't think anyone could do it, in all honesty, or do it well. But I do think that if a teacher is interested in becoming a materials writer or starting to work in as a materials writer, there are definitely ways that they can develop their skills and become better at their craft, which is exactly what John and I have done. I mean, personally speaking, the first materials that I ever wrote, and when people ask me when I became a materials writer, I always say probably the same day that I became a teacher. But my first materials were flawed, shall we say. highly flawed looking back on them. And
as in your resources you wrote for yourself or sort of published?
Yeah, the resources that I wrote to use with my students. I mean, typical things, you know, overcrowded pages, just trying to cram it all in and not really having a plan, or thinking about, you know, just thinking, oh, wow, this is a good article. I'm going to do it with my class. Or let's do a song. I mean, what does that even mean? And inexperienced teachers, that's what, you know, we all do that, don't we? We hear something and we think, oh yeah, that's great, but we don't think about everything else that is actually important, you know, and makes it useful. So you learn by doing things, you learn by trial and error, you learn by evaluating materials. And then I think I would have loved to have had somebody, when I started off, give me feedback on my materials. That would have been so useful. And as John said, I think that's something that if I were to do the course that we're running, that probably for me would be one of the most valuable parts of it, to actually get. It's like when somebody wants to write do creative writing or something, they're itching to get feedback on their own story or whatever. Everything else is useful and everything else is valuable, but what they want to know is what they've written any good, and how can they make it better, and this kind of thing.
And how did both of you learn to write good materials? Obviously trial and error and things, but were there specific qualifications you took, or were there courses when you first started writing? Kath, what about you?
No, I think that's a really good question, actually. The first time I wrote anything for a publisher was I made a poster pack for OUP, and it was basically very detailed artwork brief for the poster. This was for primary, and then about 12 worksheets that were able to be used with it, of different levels and different angles and different practice in different language, etc. And it was a lovely project, but because it was kind of not too big, and it was just great. And I learned a lot through doing that and getting feedback from an excellent editor. And I think it's worth pointing out that editors, you know, we should never make the mistake of thinking that we don't need an editor, because it doesn't matter how experienced you are and how many books you've written, you need an editor. It's teamwork, and I'm sure John would agree with me on that.
Yeah, I mean, you learn a lot from working with editors who give you feedback, and you learn sort of what works and what doesn't. I think also, if you move into writing for publishers, it's no great secret, you need to get familiar with other materials out there, and how say course books are written, or how if you're going to write worksheets for a publisher, you need to sort of look around and see what people have done in the past, and learn to recognize what makes effective materials. I think that's partly it. I mean, for me, I would think my training ground for materials writing was teacher training, really. I spent so much time observing teachers and seeing the kinds of materials that people created, and then watching them use it in class, and observing how students reacted to their materials. So it wasn't so much me taking in my own materials, it was seeing what other teachers did, and how teachers take someone else's materials and how they interpret them. And I think teacher training actually is a useful background for a materials writer to have. I'm not saying all materials writers need to have been teacher trainers. It depends a little bit on the type of material you're writing. But I think it's certainly useful to have spent time observing teachers using materials, and also seeing what materials people write, and what works and what doesn't work. You just learn a lot from doing that.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really, really good tip. Are there any sort of books or maybe podcasts or sites now that you'd recommend that a material writer should use or have, or maybe something that you used?
Are we allowed to recommend our own books?
Absolutely. Shamelessly plug.
Well, no, it's not that, but I mean, I can't think of that many. I mean, for example, I wrote in the ETpedia series.
Yes.
And I did one with Lindsay Clanfield on materials writing, and that's like sort of a series, basically 50 checklists for materials writers. So if you need 10 different ways to write a gap fill, it's in there. If you want 10 tips on writing reading comprehension questions, it's in there. I mean, it's not, it's not sort of creative genius or anything like that. It's just solid kind of useful reference material that I think is useful to have. And then EL Teacher to Writer, we've both written titles for that. I did audio video scripts. Kath?
Yeah, I did how to write primary materials. And I think there's the whole series, there's something for everyone there, I think, depending on what your context is. It's a good place to start.
Yeah, and then we've set up a YouTube channel with our course. So maybe we can provide the link after the video, but I mean, it's just a YouTube, it's a collection of, it's a mixture of things. It's interviews with materials writers. Sometimes it's tips. This week we had a video went out where we just got 5 or 6 different writers to say where they get creative ideas from when they're writing. It's just, we threw it together. It's not that professional looking, but it's literally, here's a bunch of people, this is how they do it, how do you do it, that kind of thing. So it's, we're slowly planning to sort of build up a resource. So the week before we had somebody talking about item writing. It was about a 15-minute video with some tips. So if you've never written items for an exam before, it's a useful starting point, for example.
That's really good. What's the YouTube channel called?
It's Writing ELT Materials.
Okay, perfect. Right.
There's nothing very
No. I mean, why should it be anything else? That's literally what people.
It is what it says on the tin, basically.
Exactly. Kath, sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that if anybody listening to this actually, thinks, oh, why don't you do a video about we're always kind of happy to listen to suggestions and take on suggestions, which we might then, work on.
Yeah. And how are you finding sort of juggling this alongside yourselves as well? Because obviously it's quite time consuming to create courses and create videos and keep up with social media and stuff. So are you sort of still working as freelancers yourselves alongside running your course?
Yeah, shall I go first? I think just as very often a lot of writers say that in order to write, it's important to still continue to have contact with teachers, either by teaching or teacher training, etc. And I think that maybe this kind of concept follows through to what we're doing. So in order to train teachers how to develop their materials writing skills, we probably need to continue developing our own materials writing skills or working on materials. So I think we're still writing. I think we're both trying to improve our work-life balance by working, being a bit more selective about projects that we take on, so that we've got free time as well, which is important. And I think that, we'll see what the future holds. The current course that we're running, we were very surprised by the numbers that sort of signed up straight away. And so we're running the next course is going to be in September. And I think we'll see where it takes us, and probably we'll continue to write, but maybe do less of that. See what opportunities pop up. What do you think, John?
Yeah, my work-life balance is a disaster at the moment, but that's not because of the course. It's just when you're a sort of self-employed materials writer, you have peaks and troughs of, sometimes you just have to say, well, I'm going to work this weekend. But it's fine. But I would struggle if all I did was write materials all the time. I think the materials would suffer. I need to do a little part, 20% of my life, 30% of my life needs to be doing something else. It may be connected. So the teacher training really ties in with it. And you know, when you run a teacher training course like this and you get people with different experiences, you might get somebody on the course with less experience, but they ask a question which reminds you of something you forgot or something you just take for granted. You think, oh, actually, yeah, that is that true, what I think? So you kind of get questioned, and then you get experienced people on the course who question things, and that's part of your own sort of professional development, to just be challenged a lot on, you know, on things you start to take for granted. It's all kind of healthy stuff, I think, and obviously all the work feeds into each other. So it's an important link, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really, really good tip. Like, alongside your materials writing, I know it's not for everyone, and not everyone has the possibility to do other things, but like you said, Kath, whether it's teaching or doing training alongside it, I think you sort of need that to keep the creative juices flowing as well. If you just sit and try and sort of write materials 5 days a week for X number of hours, it sort of can be quite challenging. So yeah. And what are sort of some top tips if people come off of your course and they're looking to sort of get paid for their materials, whether that's through a publisher, whether that's for other teachers paying for their materials? Is there anywhere that you would recommend going for that? And maybe John, if you've got any ideas.
I mean, I see much more activity on LinkedIn these days. I used to have a website, which is a bit sort of, you put up your website and then you wait for somebody to contact you, and it happens a bit, but it doesn't really happen unless you're interacting socially, and so LinkedIn's a good place for that. There's also people on LinkedIn who are advertising paid work that's going around, and I think it's sort of less and less that when you talk about materials writing that you're really talking about writing a course book. You're thinking more about, it'll be little bits of paid work here and there. There's a lot more companies not in the traditional ELT publisher mode that are looking for writers, like app companies. I mean, it's really interesting the types of work that are coming up now. You know, it's chunks of work to produce content to go online, but it won't necessarily form, if you like, a course book or anything like that. And those kind of jobs, you see them, you know, you see them popping up on social media quite a lot. So for me, LinkedIn, I think, is probably the best place to start if you're a writer looking for work, more so than, say, Facebook or Instagram or other places like that.
That's great. And I guess building your network as well. Sorry, Kath.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely true what John said. And I think one thing that teachers, somebody got in touch with me recently, actually, and people ask me quite often, you know, how do I get into materials writing or whatever? And I usually say the same thing. I mean, for any publisher or any company to notice you, or to, you know, the best thing you can do is to make your materials, you know, put them in a place where they're going to be seen. So it's a good idea to maybe have a, you know, to create some materials and maybe share them with other people, or maybe do a you know, maybe volunteer to, or join in to do a webinar to talk about something that you feel, you know, if you've got a certain area, if you know, if you write I don't know, phonic storybooks or whatever, then if you go and talk about that at an event of some kind, then, you know, you start getting known as, that's the person who, you know, she's the one who. So that's another thing too, you know, if you're going to just be at home waiting for offers of work to land on your lap, nothing is likely to happen. I always tell people as well to, you know, if you're afraid of doing that kind of thing on your own, to look for like-minded people to pal up with, and, you know, maybe kind of do something together, you know, because that's something that I think works well. As you will know, Billy, you know, finding a partner, finding someone who's, you know, got the same ideas as you, or, you know, you can learn from each other. And what's that expression, which I always get wrong, about the sum of your parts being bigger than your you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Somebody will tell us in the comments below what the actual saying is.
No, you're definitely right? I think having, especially because not everyone's extroverted and can put themselves on social media and sort of build their brand, which is essential if you want to sort of get paid and noticed, and especially for your niche as well, like you were saying, Kath. I think that's a great. Yeah.
It's an interesting issue, though, isn't it? With sort of when we talk about materials writing skills and the actual writing material, but then there's a whole nother skill set around it, and being able to work with other people and work in teams has just become so relevant. It's so rare that you actually write on your own these days, that if you develop that skill of being able to write with other people, and you know, and again, that sort of challenges you, because you'll read something that somebody else has written, you think, God, we've never chosen that kind of text or written about that, but okay, that works because you're right, and you kind of learn to work with that. A bit like me and Kath working together, we didn't really know each other, and we've just sort of, we both trained teachers a bit, and we hadn't done much about it, and then the two of us actually working together, kind of, when one of us feels like having a lazy day, the other one's bullying the other to get on with it. So it's a kind of healthy, yeah.
You learn to tolerate each other.
Is it that bad?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you, and yeah, I feel the same way. When I'm not having a good day, the other person can sort of take a little bit of responsibility. But then I guess in my case, with Laura, who I work with quite often, we sort of have different interests. So I'm really, really into item writing and assessment, where she's into sort of SEND materials and primary materials. So do you think it's sometimes good to have, like you two, you both have different sort of ELT writing backgrounds and training backgrounds, but sort of they work together because they're so different?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
John just opened his mouth to speak, and I jumped in, but I'll let John mention it.
No, I didn't have a particular view. I think it is useful. I mean, Kath's background is much more young learners, teens, and mine. I mean, I come from a business English for specific purposes background, which actually is why I really started writing materials, because often I was teaching students that there wasn't a course book for people who produce. I worked in a car factory, and they produced the stuff that goes in cars. Well, there wasn't a book.
Wow.
I had to get the instruction manual and create my materials. So I come more from that kind of background, and so it just means that we kind of bring in quite different different things to the content, but also the way we work is quite different, and we each have sort of slightly different skill sets for certain different things, or we enjoy doing stuff more than other things. So that kind of works from that point of view as well.
That's so interesting that you wrote English materials for people working in a car factory. That's so different to what Kath does with primary learners. That's so interesting. I've never really considered that would be a necessary thing as well.
Well, the best course I taught was the Italian police helicopter department, and they flew around in helicopters, and all the manuals came in English from America, and wow. The guy in charge had to explain it to all the police engineers, so I had to teach him the English for the manuals. So I can tell you all about how helicopters work some of the time.
Yeah. That's the beauty of our work, though, isn't it? You end up being an expert on the most obscure things, you know, the really obscure things you
Absolutely. So I just wanted to do a few quick fire questions, just because you're both legends within ELT, and I feel like we can never know enough about you. So let's start with you, Kath. What's an annual ELT or education event that you wouldn't miss, whether that's online or face-to-face?
Probably for me it would be TESOL Spain, although having said that, I've just missed the last one, but that was for circumstances beyond my control, and that's because it's a lovely event. It's nationwide. I can go there on the train or the bus. Sometimes it's very local, so it doesn't imply long distance traveling. And also that was where I had my very first book offer, so I've got fond memories of giving a workshop there. I feel like it's one of my ELT kind of family networks, if you like. So amazing.
Amazing. John, what about you?
Well, I'm based back in the UK now, so I suppose I go to IATEFL most years. But when it comes to conferences and stuff, particularly with sort of online conferences, I think it benefits material writers not always to go to something ELT related or specifically ELT. I mean, the other week I went to Oxford Brookes, ran an online event. It was sort of linked with English for academic purposes, but really it was about sustainability in education, and the plenary speakers weren't connected with ELT. They were talking about sustainability goals in relationship to education in general. And I just came across stuff at that conference that I wouldn't have found at an ELT conference, because it was coming at it from a very different perspective. And I just think that's really important, specifically for materials writers, because you suddenly come across something that surprises you, or a different perspective on something, and that's when things come up. I mean, quite often people ask me about books to read connected with materials writing and stuff, and quite often they're not actually books that were written for ELT. They might be management theory books or books on creativity, and often it's worth just signing up for an online conference which is vaguely related to what you do. You might surprise yourself and come across something interesting that way.
Actually, just jumping in there on top of what John just said, it reminded me that the Society of Authors, which is based in the UK, lots of us who are members of that organization, and they organize some amazingly interesting events, online events and face-to-face. But, you know, where, for example, you have afternoon tea with, you know, famous author who maybe they write children's books or novels or whatever. And I love those events, because you just hear them talk about their own, you know, their writing routines, or but I find them really they always come away with some ideas and like little notes and things. So yeah, I would agree with what John says there.
That's great. We've actually got an upcoming podcast episode which we're recording next week about the Society of Authors, so that was very timely. So that's great. That's great. I went to one of their conferences a few years, 5-6 years ago now, and like you said, they are really good, and they're great to be a member of as well, because yeah, they help you in all educational aspects, not just in ELT as well. What's the most valuable lesson you've learned in your ELT writing careers? Let's go Kath first.
To negotiate a good fee or conditions or pay. That sounds a little bit, you know, dull. And I'm sure there are lots of other lessons I've learned, but I think one of the huge lessons I've learned is exactly that, because when I started working for publishers, I had no idea, you know, what pay I should be expecting, or what royalties or any fee, and over the years I've come to realize that they expect you to negotiate. They don't expect you to say, when you're offered something, they don't expect you to just say, oh, thank you very much, that's lovely, I'll take that. They expect you to say, well, actually, I was thinking more lines of whatever. And it's hard. It doesn't come naturally to most of us, negotiating, but I think it's part of when you're a freelance, if you're a freelance worker, you're a business, and business people negotiate. So definitely I've learned how to negotiate. That doesn't mean to say I'm always 100% successful. Of course I'm not, but it's important. That's a really, really, really great piece of advice. I think people are always sort of scared to negotiate, aren't they? But yeah, it's definitely essential. John, what about you?
I think if possible, always try to do at least one job or have something going on that's taking you out of your comfort zone. Okay. I think with materials writing, it's easy to get into this sort of routine of naturally, if you've written one type of book, you're probably going to be asked to do something similar again. You have your area of expertise, but actually in terms of sort of interest and challenge and stuff, it's worth to have at least one project on the go writing something perhaps you wouldn't normally have chosen to write, or something that's going to require you to go off and do a bit of extra research and hard work. It's sort of it keeps the interest going and challenges you if you can.
Yeah, amazing. And finally, where do you think ELT materials writing is going in the future? John, let's start with you. Tricky one.
It's so massive, because when I started, there was a routine. You wrote a teacher's book, you wrote a workbook, you wrote a course book, and that was what existed really. And then video started. So like I say, I started making some video content. Now I could be, a materials writer could be writing online tests. You could be working with software where you write into the program to create something that's going to go onto a smartphone or an app, or something that's going onto an online course platform like Canvas or Moodle or something like that. I mean, it's so varied that the material writer who's going to make a living from it is going to have the ability to not necessarily know how to do all these things, but the skill set to be able to jump into a new project and pick it up quite quickly. I see a lot more situations where writers need more editorial skills than they used to. As a writer, I remember coming in, you had an editor, the editor dealt with the editing stuff, and now as schedules change and the way we write changes, I can see that publishers are looking for people with sort of editing, writing abilities kind of thing. And so that's kind of different. And it'll be interesting to see with artificial intelligence, stuff like ChatGPT, whether we become more sort of almost curators or editors of content. And, if we've got stuff that's generating content, then our job becomes much more of assessing its value, what's good, what's useful, that kind of thing, and piecing it together. It's strange times for materials writers. I don't think the word materials writer really quite covers it, but I also don't like terms like content creator and stuff like that. So I don't quite know what to call us these days.
Kath, what about you? That's really interesting about the ChatGPT. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I totally agree with what John said there. And the quick answer is we've got no idea. Then I suppose, we're talking about the near future or the long-term future. I think for me, one thing that strikes me as when I write course books, I'm aware more and more of all the, I'm going to call it box ticking, because in many cases it's become a kind of box ticking exercise where we have to include something about sustainability, we have to include something about social emotional learning, we have to include something about, and all of these issues are very important and meaningful, and we do need to address them. But I do wonder about the way that they're doing it at the moment. I hope it changes and it's done in a different way, because it seems to me that things are just being kind of tagged on, and I'd like to see a little bit more discussion about the whole thing. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to have a course book? We're going to meet the curriculum requirements, etc. We're going to have all the exam stuff in place, and we're going to get all this other stuff in place. I'm preparing a talk at the moment I've just finished preparing it, that I'm going to do tomorrow, and I'm just going to flash this up, right? Yeah. You can't read that, but basically this is a list. No, I don't want you to read it because that'll give the show away. But basically, it's a list of things that in Spain, teachers of English are expected to cover in their English classes, and things like values, solidarity, cooperation, education for peace, resolving conflicts, moral education, cooperation, communication, identity. There's a whole list of stuff, and each time the Ministry of Education brings out a new system, they add more things, but they don't take anything away that was there before. So I'd like to see some kind of more thoughtful dialogue about all of these things going on. That's what I'd like to see.
It's really interesting.
And then looking back and looking like instead of looking at how tech is taking off and artificial intelligence, etc., I'm wondering what's going to happen with all the people who are in danger of being left behind. You know, the people I was talking to about earlier in the low resource areas. You know, what's going to be done? You know, are they going to be catching up? How are they going to be catching up? So, for example, the places where now hopefully they'll be using my audios that are delivered by radio station. In a few years, will they just be launched straight into AI, or will they go through, you know, will they first have an internet connection? Will they then have, you know, how's that all going to work? No idea. Maybe by then John and I will have retired, and John will be sailing around the world, and I'll be sipping a martini on my balcony, and we let.
I was going to say
writers...
you can. Yeah, I was going to say you can come on and have a chat, but I don't want to interrupt your martinis and sailing trip.
We'll probably just exist as avatars, Billy. So.
So finally, where can people go to find out more about your course? What's your website, social media, things like that?
Go, Kath.
John? Oh, well, we've got a website, which is surprisingly www.writingeltmaterials.com, and that's the main place. And then we've got a LinkedIn business page, the same name. John and I are happy to speak to people directly as well. We've got the YouTube channel, and it's everywhere where we are basically is Writing ELT Materials. So it's easy to find us.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you so much both for your time as well, and for coming on and having a second chat with me. I'm excited to see where Writing ELT Materials goes, and if there'll be other spin-offs in the future, and to hear if you're going to be sailing around the world with your margaritas in the future.